Deciding to surprise her husband without her mother-in-law knowing, Susan saved a fortune teller at the airport. But as soon as the clairvoyant touched her hand, "I think it's an utterly ridiculous idea to have triplets," Mary, her mother-in-law, grumbled at Susan. "How on earth are you planning to feed such a horde of children?" "Well, I wasn't the only one involved in the process," Susan responded, astonished by Mary's reaction. "Your son played quite a part in it too." "But to have three at once," Mary protested, exasperated. "How could you be so irresponsible in making such a decision?" "I don't understand you," Susan retorted, growing frustrated. "Three grandchildren should be a cause for joy, and yet all you do is complain." To be honest, Susan herself had been just as shocked by the results of her ultrasound, when instead of the one baby she was expecting, there turned out to be three. The doctor even let her listen to each little heartbeat. Susan was in a state of disbelief as she left the doctor's office. She had wanted to share the news with her husband right away, but he was on a long business trip, and sharing such joyous news over the phone didn't feel right. So, instead, she told Mary, her mother-in-law, eager to share her secret with someone. As she hurried down the street, her belly wasn't too noticeable yet, especially hidden beneath a loose jumpsuit. But Mary was far from thrilled. In fact, she started scolding Susan. Susan couldn't help but think about how her own mother would have been overjoyed to hear such news. But her mother had passed away 7 years ago from a heart attack, leaving Susan alone at just 20 years old. The apartment they had lived in was a company-owned residence, and Susan was quickly forced to move out with her belongings. She ended up living in a dormitory at the institute where she studied. To keep her spot in the dorm, she cleaned classrooms and stairwells. It was tough, but Susan was determined to make it through. After high school, she had dreamed of a career as a doctor or at least a nurse, but once she got into medical college, she realized she was terribly afraid of the sight of blood, so much so that she would faint. Her plans had to change. Susan enrolled in a teacher training college to study child psychology, later pursuing further qualifications at the institute. Her mother had always supported her, both back then and throughout her life. Susan's father had passed away many years earlier. During her years of study, she received a survivor's pension, which provided some financial relief. Part of her savings had gone toward her mother's funeral. Her mother's death deeply affected Susan, and she coped by throwing herself into her studies. She quickly became the top student in her course. And then, she met Peter. He was the son of one of the professors, a handsome, well-off young man with a sleek car and expensive clothes. Peter embodied everything that Susan herself had been deprived of. A spoiled rich boy, he, of course, didn't attend their modest university and was a couple of years older. All the girls were drawn to Peter, but he chose her, Susan, even knowing that she spent her evenings mopping floors. Peter patiently waited for his beloved, even carrying her heavy bucket of dirty water. He wasn't entirely sure why he was so drawn to the orphan girl, perhaps it was partly out of pity. They married against his mother's and the entire family's wishes. They simply went to City Hall and registered their marriage without any grand celebrations. Mary had no choice but to accept her son's decision, but she never truly welcomed her daughter-in-law. She quietly harbored resentment, spoke ill of Susan behind her back, and looked down on her, never missing an opportunity to remind her son of it. "Peter, why did you even bring her into our lives?" Mary would complain. "So many beautiful girls were chasing after you, each one better than the last. But no, you chose her. No looks, no family, no house of her own. At least there won't be a mother-in-law," Peter would reply with a hint of sarcasm. "And as for her being homeless, you know what, Mom? That's actually a plus. She'll never forget who she owes her rescue to." "Oh, please. You found someone to pity," Mary would grumble. "You might as well have picked up some beggar off the street and taken her in. I thought I'd raised a much smarter and more mature son, but you've only disappointed me." Peter kept silent in response, though deep down, he agreed with his mother on some points. But the marriage was already sealed. Besides, Susan looked up to him with such admiration, as if he were some kind of deity. He had never encountered a woman before who was so devoted, practically willing to wash his feet and drink the water. Her devotion both flattered and frightened him. Over time, though, Susan became a burden around his neck, irritating him more and more with each passing year. But Susan had no idea. Naive as a little bird, she flitted through life with laughter. She graduated from university, worked as a teacher for 2 years, and then moved into private practice. She opened her own office and unexpectedly started making a decent living, helping children with developmental challenges. As a speech therapist, Susan was a rare and sought-after specialist, and her kindness and patience became her best tools for attracting new clients. Susan had long since stopped advertising her services. Clients found her through word of mouth. However, she couldn't help everyone. And the recent news of her pregnancy had completely thrown her off balance. Susan decided to take a break, for now, just a month. She planned to fly to her husband, tell him everything, and then figure out what they would do next. She didn't say a word about it to her mother-in-law. Instead, she simply told her that she was going to spend a week with her aunt in the countryside. Susan did visit her aunt occasionally, so it didn't raise any suspicions. Miraculously, she managed to find a plane ticket to the city where her husband was staying, despite all other tickets being sold out for a week in advance. She traveled light, not wanting to arouse suspicion from her mother-in-law, carrying only a single backpack. Check-in for her flight went smoothly, and soon boarding was announced. People began lining up at the gate. Just then, an older woman suddenly collapsed right at Susan's feet, clutching her head with her hands. Susan quickly rushed to help her. Others gathered around, supporting the woman's head, but she could barely move. Her body was seized by muscle spasms. Realizing that the woman was likely experiencing a panic attack, Susan began calmly instructing her on how to breathe. After a few minutes, the woman's condition noticeably improved. When they boarded the plane, both women discovered they were seated in the same row, with just one seat between them. As boarding continued, they struck up a conversation. "My name's Tara Fisher. I'm flying to see my daughter. She's about to have surgery, and I need to help my son-in-law with my grandson. Are you a doctor?" "No," Susan laughed. "I couldn't even handle becoming a nurse. I'm terrified of blood. I'm a special education teacher, working with children." "Are you afraid of flying?" That was a textbook panic attack. "No, I'm not afraid of flying," Tara replied, pressing her lips together. "It's something else. You see, I've had a gift since childhood. I can see things. I read cards, runes, coffee grounds, or even just by looking at someone's hand or photograph. And these fits I've had since I was little. Doctors are baffled, they can't figure out the cause. They always come out of nowhere, but always before major life changes. Whether they're good or bad, I can't say." "I see," Susan replied, already bracing herself for the moment when her seatmate would try to coax money out of her. "Well, I'm glad I could help. Hopefully, you'll feel better during the flight. You think I'm going to offer to read your fortune?" Tara smirked. "It's entirely up to you. But I'll tell you this for free, you're flying to your husband for nothing. No joy will come of it." "Oh, come on. He'll definitely be thrilled. We've missed each other so much." Susan smiled. "I think your sixth sense is malfunctioning after that panic attack. My husband and I are always happy to see each other. We have a great family." The fortune teller pulled a small notebook from her pocket, scribbled something down, and handed it to Susan. "Here, take this. My number is written there. If you ever need help, don't hesitate to call. And as for my gift, it hasn't failed me yet. We'll see who's right." Susan took the paper and casually stuffed it into her jeans pocket. Soon, the takeoff was announced, and everyone buckled in. A sweaty, overweight man in expensive clothing squeezed into the seat between Susan and Tara. He fidgeted and began grumbling. Later, as Tara tried to continue speaking with Susan, their new seatmate grew increasingly irritated. "Hey, old lady, just sit quietly, will you? You nearly delayed the boarding earlier, and now you're going to bother everyone here? Just stop yapping already." "And who do you think you are?" Susan asked, sitting on the other side of him. "What gives you the right to speak to a woman like that?" "And who the hell are you?" the man snapped back, raising his voice. "Just sit down and shut up. They fill up the plane with women, and a decent guy can't get a good flight anymore. Just hens everywhere. How dare you speak like that?" Susan retorted angrily. "Don't you think you should apologize?" "Do you even know who I am?" the man bellowed, but just then, a heavy hand settled on his shoulder. Standing next to their seats was a flight attendant in uniform, accompanied by a few burly passengers. This calmed the troublemaker down immediately. All right, no need to make a fuss," he muttered. "Just got a bit loud, that's all. Who hasn't lost their temper once in a while?" "Sorry, old lady, I'm just scared of flying. I get really nervous, and then I lash out. Today, you happen to be the one I took it out on. Normally, I'm fine." "You're worried about your wife, wondering how she's doing," Tara said thoughtfully. "Don't worry, everything will be all right. Just relax." The man looked at her in shock and fell silent in his seat. For the rest of the flight, Susan and Tara continued their conversation quietly. They managed to strike up a friendship, though Tara refrained from making any more predictions. She knew she had already pushed Susan away with her earlier warning. But Tara also understood that she couldn't stay silent when a vision came to her. She had learned that lesson the hard way. If she ignored her gift, the misfortune would turn on her instead. Upon arriving in the unfamiliar city, Susan immediately took a taxi from the airport to the hotel where her husband was staying. She recognized the name of the hotel and even its interiors from the video greetings he had sent her. The hotel turned out to be far from luxurious, more of a shabby motel, to be honest. There was no one at the reception desk, which made Susan happy, as she had planned to surprise her husband. She quietly made her way up to the second floor and gently knocked on the door of his room. A moment later, it swung open, revealing a young blonde girl wrapped in nothing but a bedsheet, laughing loudly enough to echo down the hallway. "Are you with room service?" the blonde asked, confused. "We need more champagne." "Where's Peter?" Susan asked, pushing past the shameless girl and stepping into the room. "He's in there," the blonde replied, clutching the sheet tighter around her neck. "Peter, I see you're not bored here." Susan hissed through angry tears. "What a productive business trip. And this mop and a sheet here, she must be a colleague, huh?" "Susan, enough. Fine, you caught me in the act. So what's with the hysterics now?" "Let's just talk," her husband suggested with a sigh. "But seriously, what are you even doing here?" "I came to surprise you," Susan said bitterly, forcing a smile. "I'm pregnant. With triplets. I traveled all the way out here just to tell you in person. And what do I find? My loving husband rolling around in bed with another woman? And you're not even ashamed. But I'm telling you anyway, you're going to be a father to 3 children." "That's quite the news," Peter mumbled, stunned. "All right, fine, triplets it is." "Susan, calm down, please. Just sit down, have some water. Helen will get dressed and leave, and then we can have a proper conversation. We're all civilized people here, aren't we? No need to start throwing fits. Do you really think I'm going to stay married to you after this?" Susan shot back, turning away with tears streaming down her face. "Stay with your blonde. I'm leaving, far away from both of you. And you can file for divorce yourself, okay? I don't want anything to do with you anymore. At least I found out before the babies were born, not after." She walked down the hallway, her eyes blurred with tears. A man, who turned out to be the hotel manager, chased after her, shouting that all guests had to register properly. But Susan waved him off like a bothersome fly. Once outside, she collapsed onto the nearest bench. Meanwhile, Peter was inside, pondering how to force his wife to come back. Not seeing a better option, he decided to block all her bank cards. From the start of their marriage, they had shared a joint account, and Susan had always kept her savings there too. Peter figured that without access to money, she wouldn't get far or stay away for long. After sending his blonde companion on her way, he waited for Susan to return. But Susan had no intention of running back to her cheating husband. When she discovered that none of her cards were working, she took out the piece of paper Tara had given her and dialed the number. Tara was at the hospital with her daughter but answered the call. "Did it happen? Did it come true?" Tara said sadly. "I told you, you were flying for nothing. Why break your heart over someone who won't appreciate it?" "Yes, it did," Susan sobbed. "And now it's even worse. I have nowhere to go, nothing to do. My husband blocked all my cards. The only option left is to jump off a bridge into the water with my unborn children." "Stop, push those dark thoughts away," Tara tried to calm her. "Why are such thoughts even crossing your mind? Think about it, our meeting wasn't a coincidence either. Just wait a moment, I'll check on something and call you back." Tara called her son-in-law, Mark, who was waiting for her at his small rented house, and asked if they had room for one more person in need. Mark couldn't refuse his mother-in-law's request. She had flown to the city at his urgent call, despite their less-than-ideal relationship. In truth, Tara had come to help her daughter, but even without that, Mark was grateful. An hour later, Mark picked Susan up from the park where she had been sitting, trying to figure out her next move. She climbed into the car and steadied the driver. He was thin, with reddish hair and a flushed nose. Mark brought her to the house and showed her to a small room near the entrance, then left to visit his wife at the hospital. Later, he returned with Tara and a little boy, his son. Feeling guilty about what had happened, Tara tried to talk to Susan again. "I'm so sorry, dear, for butting in with my warnings. Look at how things turned out. You could have been living a happy life, free of all this sorrow." "No, actually, I'm grateful," Susan replied. "You opened my eyes to his infidelity. Otherwise, I would have kept living like a blind fool, a laughingstock to his mistresses." "You see, I knew he was with another woman," Tara whispered. "But how could I have said that outright? Right now, I'm not in the best shape myself. My daughter is at death's door, and my grandson here is almost an orphan with living parents. Thank goodness Mark thought to call me here." "Wait, didn't you stay in touch?" Susan asked, surprised. "Family members usually call or at least exchange messages, don't they?" "Yes, we did, dear. But my daughter, Stella, she was always so secretive," Tara sighed. "You could never get a word out of her. Even now, she kept silent about her illness, hid how serious it was. And now it's too late. They managed to perform the surgery, but she fell into a coma. Now she's lying there all alone. All these secrets, how many lives they've ruined," Tara sighed deeply. "But you should go rest. You've had a rough day too." Susan obediently went to the small room that had been set aside for her. She chatted briefly with the little boy, whose name was Leo, before falling asleep without even realizing it. In her dreams, she saw a happy life where there was no place for betrayal. But she woke up with tears in her eyes. The illusion had vanished, and reality came crashing down. Her husband had cheated on her. Dragging her feet, she made her way to the kitchen. Mark was boiling water for tea and offered her a sandwich and some cocoa. Susan quickly made some tea and whipped up an omelet from the eggs she found in the fridge. They chatted casually while they ate. Then the phone rang. Mark awkwardly joked. "We're afraid of every call now," he said, picking up the receiver. After listening for a moment, he responded, "Got it." By the expression on his face, Susan immediately knew. Mark sat down, buried his face in his hands, and began to sob uncontrollably. It was something she hadn't expected. Suddenly, Mark, as if possessed, started pounding the table with his fists. How could this happen? She was only 30, in the prime of her life. Stella, my star, how are we supposed to go on without you? Mark wailed. She's gone. Her heart stopped. We need to go, Susan. But I can't drive right now. Do you know how to drive? I have a license, but I haven't driven in a long time, Susan admitted. Maybe it's better if we call a taxi? And with what money? I don't print it, you know. We still have to plan the funeral and the wake, he sighed. No, I'll pull myself together, and we'll go. The child and the old woman are alone there, we have to get there. Will you come with me? Of course, I won't leave you at a time like this, Susan said indignantly. By the way, why do you call Tara crazy? She seems all right to me. Oh, really? Perfectly normal with her predictions and all that nonsense, Mark snapped bitterly. Stella didn't even talk to her mother because of her reputation. She was a famous fortune teller, you know. There was even an incident where she was kidnapped to pressure her. Stella just didn't want to risk our family and our child anymore. In the end, we left, moved far away from my oh-so-wonderful mother-in-law and her enemies. They quickly gathered their things and drove to the hospital. There, they found Tara in a complete daze, while little Leo was huddled in a corner, terrified. While Susan tried to comfort the child, Mark struggled to bring Tara back to her senses. But she kept babbling incoherently and swayed unsteadily, her gestures becoming more erratic. A doctor passing by suddenly stopped, noticing Tara's condition, and urgently asked her, "Smile, right now." "Come on," the doctor shouted down the corridor. "We need a stretcher, now. We've got a stroke here. Prepare the third ICU." Tara was quickly lifted onto a stretcher and whisked away. Leo began to tremble and burst into tears. Mark ran off to find out what was happening with his mother-in-law and to arrange the transfer of his wife's body. The little boy, now motherless, clung desperately to Susan, repeating over and over, "I have no one left. Where's my mommy? Do you know? And where's Grandma? Where did they take her? Why? Everything will be all right. Grandma is still here," Susan tried to reassure him gently. "Let's go over there. See that toy vending machine? When your dad comes back, he'll give you a coin. Here, go try to get that capybara toy," Mark said, handing a coin to his son when he returned. He then turned to Susan with a grim expression. "Bad news. Tara had a stroke, likely paralysis. They're still assessing, but I might be bringing home a bedridden invalid." "And Stella?" Susan asked. "Have you found out when you can collect her for the funeral?" "They'll do an autopsy to cover their tracks, then release her," Mark said indifferently. "I need to find money. You don't happen to have any, do you? These days, being born and dying are the most expensive things you can do. Don't get me wrong, I'm not heartless. I've known for a while this was coming. I've been checking prices, making plans." Stella herself talked about it calmly, without any illusions. "You know how I ended up in this city," Susan sighed. "I'm here with nothing, all thanks to my husband. I could try transferring something from an online bank, but I doubt he's left me access." "Don't worry about it, I was just asking," Mark said, trying to brush it off. "I'll find the money. I'm sure Tara brought something with her for Stella's treatment, maybe it'll be enough." They drove back home. It was time for Leo to eat and go to bed. Susan was once again struck by how calm and well-behaved the little boy was. "What surprises you?" Mark replied when she mentioned it. "He spent most of his life with a sick mother. You either become an angel or fall apart in a situation like that." While Susan was dealing with other people's problems, Peter was trying to figure out his next move. His wife's pregnancy hadn't been part of his plans. He had hoped to start living with his lover, Helen, but now that seemed unlikely. Peter was furious. He kept calling Susan, but she refused to answer. That's when he remembered the tracking app he had once installed on her phone. Susan had been afraid to walk alone across an empty lot in the evenings, so, at her request, Peter had used the app to make sure she was moving along her route and not lingering in one place. It gave her some peace of mind. She hadn't even expected him to meet her after work. Meanwhile, Susan was going through a rough time. While Mark was busy running between funeral homes, she kept little Leo entertained. The child, despite being well-behaved, clearly missed his mother. On top of that, Susan was now experiencing morning sickness. She felt nauseous all the time and couldn't bear the sight or smell of food. As soon as Mark returned home, Susan headed to the hospital, leaving him to take care of Leo. The news at the clinic was far from reassuring. Tara was indeed paralyzed and would need constant care. Changing her adult diaper, Susan could barely keep her nausea in check. The doctor had been blunt. Tara's condition was likely irreversible. She would never be the same again, although there was some hope that she might partially regain her speech. The doctor warned that the hospital was overcrowded, and they wouldn't be able to keep her for long. Soon, they would have to move her to Mark's home. When Susan returned, Mark, who had just put Leo to bed, was waiting anxiously for an update. She told him everything honestly. He cursed under his breath and replied, "Well, we've got nothing to lose now. We need to bury Stella. By the time Tara is out of bed, we'll have gone broke just keeping Stella's body at the morgue." "Yes, I understand," Susan sighed. "I'll help however I can." "You're already doing more than enough," Mark acknowledged. "Don't think I haven't noticed. It's just, there's so much going on right now." "Of course," Susan replied quietly. "Can you stay with us for a while?" Mark asked directly. "That way, I can at least get back to work. We'll manage somehow." "Let's deal with the funeral first, and then we can decide," Susan said. "I'm not feeling too great myself right now. Carrying triplets is taking a toll on me." "What? You're pregnant?" Mark's eyes widened. "Then forget about the funeral. You don't need a miscarriage on top of everything else." "I'll be fine. I can handle it," Susan replied. "I never met Stella while she was alive, so at least I can honor her memory now." "Susan, this is a terrible idea," Mark tried to dissuade her. "Especially with triplets. I've never heard of anything like this before. You need to take care of yourself, not push yourself to the brink." "I'm not tired," Susan responded, irritated. "It's all stress anyway, and staying busy at least keeps my mind off things." 3 days later, the funeral took place. Mark chose to have Stella cremated to save money on a burial plot and other expenses. On the day of the funeral, Stella was dressed like a bride in a white gown. Little Leo kept touching her hand, tugging at her, trying to wake her up. Susan struggled to keep an eye on him. Mark was constantly in tears, as were Stella's colleagues from the music school where she had taught piano. The farewell lasted for an hour. Afterward, everyone who wished to did their best to comfort Mark. Many mistook Susan for Stella's sister or cousin, given their similar appearances, both slender, fair-haired, with porcelain skin. That evening, Mark drank himself into a stupor, shouting and howling on the porch, terrifying both Susan and Leo. They sat together under Susan's blanket, the little boy trembling all over. Susan was unnerved too. Mark's behavior was beyond what she had expected. The next morning, Mark was back to normal, as if the previous night's outburst had never happened. A week later, they brought Tara home from the hospital. She was bedridden but trying to sit up, though she was far from being able to stand. Mark scolded Susan whenever she tried to lift anything heavy, as Tara was a large woman. Susan's days flew by as she cared for both Tara and Leo. Mark was gone most of the time, working long hours and only returning to sleep. In the mornings, he would leave some money on the table. One evening, the doorbell rang, and Susan, not suspecting anything, opened the door without hesitation. Peter barged in, shoving her aside, storming into the house. He found Mark in the kitchen, just sitting down for dinner, and immediately started shouting. "So you're playing the saint, huh, Susan? But you've got a lover on the side, don't you?" How does that halo feel on your pretty little head? And you, how do you like messing around with my wife? I was widowed a week ago. What the hell are you talking about? Mark stood up, his eyes blazing with fury. So you two were sneaking around even before your wife died, huh? Now go on, enjoy your happy little family life. Peter shouted. Maybe those kids aren't even mine, huh? Come on, man, confess, when did it start between you two? Mark lunged at him with fists flying, landing blows that split Peter's lip, cut his brow, and hit him square in the ear. He drove Peter back toward the door, barely giving him time to defend himself against the faster and more skilled opponent. Despite his unassuming build, Mark had once been a professional boxer and knew how to fight. Peter was only now realizing this the hard way. Peter shouted at Susan, "Fine, stay with your precious widower. But don't even think about coming home. You'll crawl back to me on your knees, begging for forgiveness. But don't count on it. This is it, I'm done." "I don't even want to," Susan replied, her voice steady. "Not after the circus you just pulled." "You're the clown," Peter muttered angrily. "You came here for what?" "Lied to my mother about going to your aunt's." "Are you leaving or not?" Susan shot back. "Get going already, your bed is probably getting cold." Peter stormed out, and once the door was closed, Susan and Mark exchanged glances and burst into laughter. The absurdity of the situation was hard to ignore. "He's completely unhinged," Mark said, finally catching his breath. "You can tell he's a spoiled rich kid who's never been in a real fight. He's a professor's son, what do you expect?" Susan smiled. "Though he can play the violin." "Well, my Stella could make the piano sing," Mark said, his voice softening. "It could bring tears to your eyes. Leo's got talent too. I'll enroll him in a music school when things settle down. But for now, I'm declaring a rest hour. After all that stress, we all need some sleep." As Peter left Mark's house, he headed back to the hotel. He and Helen already had tickets booked to fly back to his hometown. In truth, Peter hadn't been tracking Susan to win her back. He simply wanted to confirm that she was taking the same flight. But that grumpy red-haired man clearly wasn't letting go of Susan anytime soon. Peter packed his things at the hotel, picked up Helen in a taxi, and called his mother. "Mom, guess what? Helen and I are flying out. Get the guest room ready." "And what about Susan?" Mary asked sternly. "Did you take care of everything with her?" "Yeah, just pack up all her stuff and send it to her aunt. Otherwise, she'll start whining that we threw away something valuable. Don't forget her diploma and all that other useless paperwork." "All right, son, I'll be expecting you and Helen," Mary replied. From the airport, Peter and his lover drove straight home. By the time they arrived, Mary had already sent a car to deliver Susan's belongings to her aunt in the countryside. While still in the taxi, Peter texted his wife to inform her that nothing in the house belonged to her anymore. Her things were gone, and she had no reason to return. He also added that he would handle the divorce himself, without dividing their assets. When Susan read the message, she burst into tears. But then she steeled herself, promising that this would be the last time she allowed Peter to play with her emotions. Resolutely wiping away her tears, Susan went to feed Tara. As she was doing so, she found herself pouring her heart out to her bedridden patient. Tara, though her speech was still slurred, managed to say clearly enough, "Everything will be fine, my dear. You're speaking. It's a miracle." Susan exclaimed with joy. "The doctor said there was almost no chance. So doctors can be wrong after all?" "Sweetheart, Stella, you've recovered," Tara smiled, her eyes bright. But the smile faded from Susan's face. She realized that Tara was mistaking her for her deceased daughter, Stella. Trying to convince her otherwise seemed hopeless. After settling Tara into bed, Susan waited for Mark to return and told him what had happened. He shook his head, concerned. "It's no wonder she's losing her mind, given everything she's been through. It's probably a good thing she didn't attend the funeral. She wouldn't have survived it. We should have a doctor check her out. The brain damage might be worse than we thought. Yes, we should definitely call a doctor, Susan agreed. Let him examine her and advise what we can do. Maybe there are some new medications he can prescribe. But otherwise, it seems like there's some improvement. All right, I'll make the call tomorrow, Mark promised. You need to rest more too. You look pale and exhausted, barely able to stand. Shouldn't you be seeing a doctor yourself to register for your pregnancy? Yes, I'll take care of it, Susan promised. The doctor's visit the next day did little to lift their spirits. He was pleased to see that Tara had regained some speech and praised Susan for her work with her patient, using her skills as a speech therapist. But he had no good news to offer. The symptoms indicated that Tara was suffering from cognitive impairment. She couldn't distinguish between reality and her confused memories. Perhaps it's a defensive reaction of the brain, something that could be reversible, the doctor explained. You know, stress can trigger such responses. But it could also be something more serious, like dementia. It's crucial that you carefully monitor her condition and inform me of any changes. Do you understand? Yes, of course, Susan nodded. But how long could this stress response last? Well, you see, the human brain is still largely a mystery, the doctor replied with a smile. In her case, it seems she may have completely erased the memory of her real daughter and replaced it with you. Unfortunately, this could be a permanent cognitive impairment. Susan felt disheartened but decided to keep a special notebook to document all the changes in Tara's condition. To her relief, Tara was making small but significant progress. She started getting up on her own, sitting, and even making it to the bathroom. Gradually, she seemed to be on the road to recovery. Meanwhile, Peter continued to bombard his ex-wife with threatening messages. He had already filed for divorce but was impatient for it to be finalized immediately, even though there was no property to divide. Still, he was anxious, expecting Susan to pull some trick. What Peter didn't realize was that Susan was far too preoccupied to even think about him. Susan was tormented by the need to respond to the name Stella and to act as Tara's daughter. The constant pretense was pushing her to the brink of a nervous breakdown. It was in this frazzled state that Susan went to register for prenatal care. The clinic was part of a maternity hospital where the same doctors handled both prenatal checkups and deliveries. She was assigned to a doctor named Gary Brown, as indicated on his badge. He was a young man who looked like he had only recently completed his residency. Yet, the waiting room buzzed with unanimous praise. Dr. Gary is amazing, very attentive. If you're going to have a baby, he's the one you want. Susan was lucky to get an appointment with the much-recommended doctor purely by chance, as the regular physician for her area was out sick. Dr. Brown examined Susan, asked her questions, then asked her to wait while he attached some monitors to her belly. The room filled with the sound of 3 heartbeats. You're quite weak, Dr. Brown said, frowning. Your blood pressure is extremely low, and I suspect your hemoglobin levels are awful. I recommend a hospital stay to eliminate stress factors. And how am I supposed to eliminate stress, doctor? Susan sighed. When my husband is divorcing me, leaving me stranded in a strange city without a penny, and I'm living on charity from strangers. On top of that, the grandmother I'm staying with has dementia and thinks I'm her deceased daughter. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be pouring my heart out like this. Remember, you can trust a doctor and a priest with anything, Gary said with a reassuring smile. So, shall I go ahead and arrange for your hospital admission? You can rest, we'll run some tests, gather your medical history, and then we can manage your pregnancy properly. Is there any way to avoid hospitalization? Susan asked, worried about leaving Tara alone. My dear, you're at risk of a miscarriage, and you're carrying triplets, Gary replied gently but firmly. I can't let you go home like this. Let's take care of it right away. You're a rare and special case for me. This will be my first time delivering triplets. So let's do everything we can to keep both you and the baby safe. Thank you, Susan said, touched by his concern. Well, if you really think it's necessary. Absolutely, Gary responded decisively. He locked his office and led her down the corridors to the maternity ward. The nurses promptly provided her with a nightgown, robe, and slippers. Later that evening, Mark brought over a package with a mug, spoon, and other essentials. Though he was clearly disappointed to lose his free help in caring for his mother-in-law, he understood that Susan needed care too. Meanwhile, at home, Tara was restless with worry. When Leo and Mark arrived, she even managed to stand up to greet them, demanding, "Where's Stella? What have you done with my daughter?" "She's in the hospital," Mark replied through clenched teeth. The lie about his deceased wife was becoming harder for him to bear. "Tell her to get discharged as soon as possible. Or are you hiding something from me? Where's Stella? Answer me!" Tara cried out, collapsing onto the bed and pounding the mattress with her fists. She had a full-blown hysterical fit. Mark had no choice but to call an ambulance to prevent another stroke. Tara was taken to a hospital located just across from the maternity ward where Susan was staying. Now, Mark faced another challenge, finding someone to take care of Leo while he worked. Meanwhile, Gary showed a noticeable warmth towards Susan. During her days in the hospital, she finally got some much-needed rest, regained a healthier color in her cheeks, and felt better overall, thanks in part to the nutritious diet. Gary briefly shared Susan's story with the nurses and orderlies, and they, too, took a liking to her. They made an effort to give her the best portions of food and were as gentle as possible during injections and blood draws. During his overnight shift, Gary would often drop by Susan's room, entertaining the patients and staff with jokes. Under his warm gaze, the young woman pregnant with triplets would blush. A few days later, they were already on a first-name basis and even took a walk together in the hospital garden. Gary gently held Susan's hand as they strolled. He shared that he had recently gone through a divorce himself. His wife had left him for his former best friend. But he bore no grudges. His wife, the friend, and Gary himself had been college classmates. Their love triangle had a long history. She had initially chosen one, only to later realize her mistake. As they chatted, they were startled when Mark suddenly emerged from the bushes, clearly smelling of alcohol. "So this is where you've been hiding," he shouted, scaring the birds away. "And here I am, waiting for our princess to finish her little stroll. Since you're up and walking, maybe you should check on my mother? She's lost her precious Stella and can't find her anywhere. She's right there, in the hospital across the street." "Mark, have you been drinking?" Susan asked. "And where's Leo?" "He's at home." "What's the big deal?" "The boy will be fine. You tell me instead, what's this cozy walk with the good doctor all about? Am I not good enough for you? Fine, let this Dr. Doolittle bring you care packages from now on." "Mark, you left the child alone," Susan said, her voice rising in frustration. "You can't do that. He's only got you now." "Oh, shut up. Who are you to lecture me on how to behave? And what about your little strolls? Do they align with medical ethics, or should I file a complaint? Tell me, Susan, are you just looking for a better deal for that pregnant belly of yours? Sure, us poor folks can't compete with your fancy doctor here." "Mark, you're drunk. Go sleep it off," Susan pleaded. From the stress, she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. Her face turned pale. Gary quickly guided her back inside, and while everything turned out fine, she had to spend the night on 4 drips. Mark came back a few more times, also drunk, but he was denied entry. Then he left a note. "I couldn't take it anymore. I gave up. Leo is locked in the house. The key is under the doormat. There's money on the table to last a while, along with the documents for my son and mother-in-law. Goodbye." Susan was even more distressed upon reading it. Her blood pressure spiked, and she felt worse than ever. She hoped it was just a cruel drunken prank, but Gary wasn't convinced. He immediately suggested they go check, but he was tied up with back-to-back deliveries throughout the day. It wasn't until the evening that Gary was able to leave. At the house, he found Leo asleep on the floor. The little boy couldn't understand what this stranger wanted. In a hurry, Gary packed up the belongings of both women and the child, gathering money and documents from the table. He put Leo in the car and drove back to the hospital. When Leo saw Susan, he ran to her, hugging her tightly, and began to recount everything. "I'm brave, I'm already 6 years old, Dad said so, but it was still scary," Leo said, his voice trembling. "Oh, you poor thing," Susan hugged him tightly. "Don't worry, we'll get through this together." "Is Dad gone for good?" Leo asked seriously. He was so scary these last few days. He always smelled weird, yelled, and said bad things about you and Grandma. He even mentioned Mom and shouted awful things about her. Then he said you were going to take me away and left. "Oh, Leo, the thing is, I'm still in the hospital," Susan explained gently. "And Grandma is there too for now." "Don't worry, we'll take care of the little one," said one of the nurses, whose name was Amanda. "I've got grandkids his age staying with me. One more mouth to feed won't be a problem. And once you're out of the hospital, you can take your Leo home." "Can I visit Susan?" Leo asked Amanda hopefully. "Of course, you can. I live just a couple of steps away. Anytime you want to come by, just do it. And Dr. Gary will check in on you too." "All right, I'm okay with that," Leo agreed with a nod. "Will there be food?" Immediately, everyone around bustled to prepare something for the boy. They brought him a plate of stewed potatoes and juice from the kitchen. Once Leo had eaten his fill, Amanda took the now sleepy and satisfied boy to her home, leaving him in the care of her older grandchildren, who promised to watch over him. With Leo taken care of, Susan finally felt a sense of relief, but she still worried about Tara. Gary, however, had already checked on her condition. There was no longer any immediate threat to Tara's life. When Susan was feeling better, she and Leo went together to visit her. Tara hugged them tightly, kissing Leo all over his face. Turning to Susan, she said, "So, Stella, you finally listened to me and traded Mark for a decent husband. Good for you. That other one was no good, useless, really. Why did you need someone like him? But this one's all right. Handsome, too. Reminds me of my late John, except without the mustache. Everything is fine, Tara. The important thing is that you keep getting better," Susan said softly. "I'll come back to visit again. I'm still in the hospital myself." "Well, it's not too bad here. The food's good, and there's a nice view from the window," Tara replied cheerfully. "But you take care, my dear, and get well soon. Oh, by the way, why did you tie that pillow to your front? It looks so funny." Susan and Gary left Tara's room, laughing with a mix of amusement and pity. Holding hands, they walked through the hospital courtyard. "Susan, are we going to take Grandma home?" Leo suddenly asked, his voice full of concern. "Or will she have to stay in the hospital forever?" "We'll take everyone home," Gary answered for her. "In about a week, once Susan is discharged, you'll all move in with me. It's a beautiful house with a garden. We have a dog and a cat. You're not afraid of animals, are you?" "No, I love them. We just never had any," Leo replied. "So, in a week? I'll be waiting." They dropped Leo off with Amanda and started walking back to the hospital. Susan leaned on Gary's arm, feeling a peace she hadn't known in a long time. After a moment, she asked, "Listen, won't we be a burden to your household?" "There's no one to bother," Gary smiled. "My mother lives in Italy with my stepfather. He has vineyards there. She left me the house. My father has a new family far away in the Far East, and he's happy there too. Aren't you worried about my age?" Susan asked hesitantly. "I mean, I'm already 28. Are you kidding?" Gary laughed. "I'm 33. It's just genetics." I take after my mom. I still look like an intern, even though I've been practicing for years. Really? I thought you were younger. Susan laughed along. But wait, moving in, all of this. Why would you want a pregnant single mother expecting triplets? What if I've fallen in love with her? Gary said with a playful smile. Would you really object to having a doctor as a husband? Oh, but I have to deal with my past first and get divorced, Susan sighed. All right, once I'm out, I'll take care of it. If you need help, I'm willing to speak with your ex myself, Gary offered. No, I can handle it, Susan smiled. Don't worry. A week later, they all moved into Gary's house. The hospital stay had done wonders for Tara. She was now almost fully lucid, though she still refused to believe that Susan wasn't her daughter. Gary suggested consulting a reputable psychiatrist he knew. The doctor came to their home, and Tara spent nearly 2 hours alone with him in a separate room. When they emerged, Tara's eyes were filled with tears. She hugged Susan tightly and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for everything you've done for me. I remembered what I wanted to forget." "Susan, will you tell me how Stella's funeral went?" Tara asked. "Of course, but remember, you shouldn't get too upset," Susan reminded her gently. "There are 2 doctors in the house," Gary smiled. "In case anything happens, we're right here." The women sat together, hugging each other, and talked for a long time. Leo joined them, falling asleep in his grandmother's arms. Tara spoke softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "All my premonitions came true, just as I expected. Now we have to deal with all the paperwork. I'll need to apply for guardianship of Leo, since his father's useless and abandoned him. And you'll need to get a divorce and remarry." "We'll manage," Susan said confidently. "It turns out I can file everything remotely. Now I just need to convince Peter to file for divorce himself, while the kids haven't arrived yet." Peter was thrilled at the prospect of resolving all his problems at once and avoiding child support payments. They were divorced within a month. Susan received her copy of the divorce certificate by mail. Peter was absolutely happy. In his excitement, he even proposed to his lover but changed his mind when his mother didn't approve. Gary and Susan got married the same day the divorce certificate arrived by mail. Less than a month remained until the bride's due date. They didn't throw a big celebration, they were already completely happy just becoming a family. Of course, the local registry office was accommodating. The daughter of the head of the office had already given birth with Gary and was planning to return for her second child. Gary used his connections to help sort out the issue with Leo. The boy was placed in his grandmother's care. Since Tara had enough assets and a solid bank account, there were no questions. Taking parental rights away from the irresponsible father, Mark, wasn't easy, but Tara was determined to do it. She fully recovered from the stroke and even began using a treadmill for walking. She still used a cane to walk on the streets. One night, Susan suddenly felt that the bed was wet. Her husband was on an overnight shift. She called Gary, who immediately sent an ambulance and later met her at the department. "Gary, I'm scared," Susan whispered. "What if something goes wrong? We have the best team, professional midwives, and I'm, well, not the worst doctor in this city," Gary smiled. "Or would you prefer someone else?" "Oh, you always joke around," Susan said, irritated. "But I'm really scared, and the pain keeps getting worse." Everything went quickly and wasn't too frightening. 3 hours later, everyone was congratulating Susan on the birth of the triplets. They were girls, and the parents decided to name them Linda, Amber, and Maria. Tara continued living with Gary, along with her grandson. He even arranged for them to have temporary registration so that Leo could attend kindergarten and eventually school. After being discharged, Tara was a huge help to Susan in caring for the babies. Though the girls were calm, they still took up a lot of time and energy. One day, Tara called Susan for a conversation. They sat in the garden, with Adrian, a fluffy dog, chasing butterflies, while Leo ran after him with a net. The girls were peacefully asleep in their stroller. Susan, I'm not making this public, Tara began cautiously, but my past work has brought in a good income. I have a few apartments, a bank account, and a car. I want to give you part of this property. Why? Susan asked, surprised. Let everything go to Leo. I'm not going to live forever, and no one knows what will happen, Tara sighed. Consider this a thank you, and a payment for a possible promise. If something happens to me, please adopt Leo or take him into your care. He's had enough of irresponsible adults ruining his life. Okay, I promise, Susan said. But you don't have to give me anything in return. I've already seen your integrity, Tara smiled. You saved me, and you didn't abandon Leo. That means a lot to me. I insist on you accepting the gift. All right, as you say, Susan smiled back. She was living in a state of peacefulness and happiness. Gary adored his wife and daughters, carrying them all in his arms, well, one at a time, of course. His mother, Susan's new mother-in-law, called them from Italy via video chat and sang lullabies to the granddaughters. She knew Susan's story but, like Gary, considered the girls part of her family, and no one ever disputed that. Eventually, Gary was offered the position of head of the department. This allowed him to give up night shifts, and now, in the evenings, the father of the large and noisy family spent time at home. Susan received her educational documents from her aunt by mail and began quietly thinking about restarting her business, but now in the city where she was living. Peter's life, however, wasn't as smooth. In the first wave of euphoria from his divorce and the absence of the need to support a whole bunch of children, he was incredibly happy. But soon, life with Helen began to bore him. She was only interested in money. She drained Peter's accounts like a bunch of ripe grapes and then deliberately quarreled with Mary. Mary immediately disliked her son's lover. You control Peter too much. Helen screamed at the top of her lungs. He can't even sneeze without your permission. How are we supposed to get married and give you grandchildren in this situation? Thanks, Helen. He already made them with one wife. We barely survived that, Mary replied. And why do you even want this? You'll ruin your figure, and that's your only asset. You don't even have that, Helen retorted. Maybe you should fix your own personal life before it's too late and leave Peter alone. Please, I don't believe for a second that someone with your flashy appearance is interested in my son, Mary said dismissively. Believe whatever you want, Helen smirked. When she disappeared from their lives, Mary noticed that some of her jewelry was missing. She even thought about reporting her son's lover to the police, but Peter talked her out of it. He didn't want any more public shame. After losing Helen, Peter started drinking heavily. He lost his job, and money became scarce. He grabbed onto any idea, no matter how ridiculous. One day, his drinking buddies suggested an interesting thought. After all, Peter had children, and that meant not only child support but also government benefits. Ecstatic, he began explaining this theory to his mother, but she didn't understand. Peter, are you crazy? Where are we going to put 3 babies? What benefits? Mary lamented. Do you know how much it costs to raise children every month? You'll go broke just buying diapers. Well, let Susan pay me child support then, Peter laughed. That way, I'll have more money. Who's going to take them away from their mother? She doesn't drink, unlike you. Mary sighed, pitying her hopeless son. She's a homeless vagabond. Peter protested, unaware that his ex-wife had already remarried. The kids are in danger. And as their father, I'm ready to offer them a helping hand. Just sit down. You need someone to help you get out of the hole you've dug for yourself, his mother smirked. But Peter didn't listen and filed a lawsuit in court. However, his claim was rejected. His dream of receiving benefits was shattered. Peter sank further into the depths of his life, and soon even his mother stopped letting him through the door. As for Susan, everything was going well. Even her ex-husband's foolish actions didn't cast a shadow over her life. She and Gary, along with the children, managed to take a week-long trip to Italy to visit her mother-in-law. Afterward, they returned and spent the rest of the vacation together, helping Tara with the legal process to remove Leo's father's parental rights. It all ended in a complete victory. Now Tara had full legal rights to her grandson, and she considered Susan her adopted daughter. Everyone was completely satisfied with